And then if you look at research by positive psychologists, they'll say there's nothing in the world that is sufficient to guarantee you having a happy life. But there's only one thing that is necessary, and no, you don't find any happy people who don't have this, which is a circle, big or small, of close friends. So this stuff is just so fundamental to living a fulfilling life as well as having a healthy life.
Welcome back to the Freedom Pact podcast. Today on the show, my guest is Max Dickins, a comedian, actor, presenter, playwright, and most recently, the author of Billy No Mates, How I Realized That Men Have a Friendship Problem. Before we get into this episode, I just want to let you know that we were having some technical difficulties during this episode, and so my camera quality may be very blurry. But I promise you that the value in the episode is still fantastic. I hope you enjoy. So let's start right at the start. You mentioned that you realized that when you were shopping for an engagement ring that you didn't really have anyone you could ask to be your best man. Now, you didn't have any close friends, anyone close enough, but I wonder, what was the reality? What was the state of your connections, if not friendships at that point? Were there, maybe loose friendships here and there, or was it actual loneliness?
I mean, this is a really good question. So I don't think you realize you've got a friendship problem until you really need friends. So I was thinking of getting married, thinking of proposing to my girlfriend, Naomi. And when you do that, when you get married, it's one of the few points in your life where you literally audit your social life. You have to write a list of your friends. You have to prioritize them, which is slightly bizarre. And the best man thing is a real sort of the summit of that. But I wouldn't say I felt or I was conscious of feeling very lonely, because I was busy. I was busy with work stuff. I was busy hanging out with my girlfriend's friends. I did family bits. So it wasn't like I looked like loneliness. So I say in the book, loneliness doesn't look like me. I'm a young-ish, outgoing guy. I'm quick to buy my round at the bar. But when push came to shove and I needed a close friend, so not just what you might call mates, someone you hang out with occasionally, have a beer, when I actually needed a proper close friend, and we can maybe get into definitions of what that means, I realized that I didn't really have anyone who was male to fill that role. And actually, a lot of other men are in the same boat.
Yeah, you touched on it there. So at the end of this journey now, of the process of writing this book, how would you now define friendship versus how you would have defined it 5 years ago?
Yeah, so friend and friendship is famously hard to define. People have been trying to do it since Aristotle 2,500 years ago. But I think we all acutely know that there is a difference between a stranger, an acquaintance, a friend, and a close friend, right? And the boundaries are a bit muddy. But I think you could define friend, and I think I define friend as someone to hang out with. But actually, I think a close friend is more profound than that. A close friend is someone that you feel really knows you on an intimate level, and you really know them. It's kind of a unique sense of knowledge, shared knowledge of one another. And that can come through talk or through sharing time and adventures together. But if you look at so my book's explicitly about men, and this is true of me and true of men generally. The Movember Foundation, which is a mental health charity, recently did a survey and asked men, how many close friends have you got? And 1 in 3 said no one at all. And they asked that same group of friends, the same group of people, I should say, how many people in your life could you talk about something really important, such as a health worry, money worry, relationship worry with? And 50% of the men they asked could think of no one at all. So this connects to what I think a really close friend is, which is someone that you trust to have that sense of disclosure with, you could go to when times are tough, and also the people you ring first when you're like, oh, I'm having a great time, I want someone to celebrate with, and I want to share that with you as well.
So there may be people listening right now who think, maybe they're not the type of person that, needs friends, that friends are more of a luxury than a necessity. Why can this be defined as a problem? What are the mental and physical effects of having no close friendships?
So, I mean, it's a really good question. And I should say that there's not a perfect number of friends. And there's loads of research that says that introverts have less friends. They maybe have closer friendships, but less of them. Extroverts have more friends, but they're slightly shallower. And that's fine. And I'm not here to tell people exactly how to live their lives. You asked about the mental and physical sort of consequences of not having friends. It's loneliness and lack of friendship is very closely linked to bad mental health and depression. The Samaritans, a mental health charity, suicide is a very complex thing. And for men, it's the biggest killer of men under 45 in the UK. And it's quite a big problem globally as well. They say isolation is a real big factor in male suicide rates. But then we kind of think we get that not having friends might make us miserable. But what we might not understand is actually our physical bodies affected by it. And this is something that really surprised me. So there's loads of research around this. Julia Holt-Ludstad, who's a psychologist and a big researcher here, has done some quite famous research, which showed that having no friends, being lonely, was worse for you than smoking 15 cigarettes a day, worse for you than being really fat, worse for you than drinking far too much. So it really affects your physical body as well as your mental body, if you like. And then rather than just talking about misery, if I can share one more thing here, there's lots of research around happiness. So Robert Waldinger at Harvard did this longitudinal study taking loads of guys that graduated Harvard and other people in the Boston area, I think in the 1950s and 60s, followed them through their life. And at the end, they're like 90 years old, hundreds of these guys. And the thing that made the biggest difference to their happiness was their close friendships, their close relationships. And then if you look at research by positive psychologists, they'll say there's nothing in the world that is sufficient to guarantee you having a happy life. But there's only one thing that is necessary. And no, you don't find any happy people who don't have this, which is a circle, big or small, of close friends. So this stuff is just so fundamental to living a fulfilling life as well as having a healthy life.
And you mentioned that since they started tracking these or looking at the metrics since the 70s, that men have always had significantly less friends than women. I wonder, as the years go on and we catch up to the modern day, has that gap started to bridge at all? Or
so what's really interesting is actually it hasn't changed whatsoever. So that when social scientists started measuring relationships and friendships in the early 70s, men have had less friends than women, especially less close friends. That hasn't changed. So famously, there's lots of research post-pandemic that men are suffering a friendship recession, they call it. So they're saying rather than getting better, it's getting worse, this problem. And I think to kind of be more specific about this, there are certain pinch points in a life where it's hard to have friends and maintain friendships, whether you're male or female, but it seems to be worse for men. So your social life peaks in your late 20s, the research suggests, which kind of makes sense. You have tons of time. Then you turn 30, you get into your 40s, 50s. Everyone's social world slightly shrinks, but men's shrinks more than women's. So kind of the big question is, what's going on here? Why is it that men have less friends than women? Why do we find this harder? And that's sort of what I set out to find out for my own sake as well as everyone else's.
So you mentioned there's two major overarching problems with male friendships. Number one, they lack intimacy. So I think a lot of men, even listening to this now, they may be weirded out by the word intimacy. But what does the word intimacy look like to you in an effective friendship?
I mean, this is kind of getting to the crux of a lot of what I looked at. So there's arguably two ways of looking at intimacy, and it might be slightly male and slightly female. So one form of intimacy is kind of what I discussed, is that sense of really knowing someone, talking about the deeper stuff inside of you, how you feel about things, any tough things you're going through, that kind of sense of sharing personal information and feeling comfortable doing that. And a lot of psychologists a lot of therapists would say that's absolutely crucial, and a lot of people think that that is true intimacy. However, there's also a school of thought, and I think there's a lot in this, but there's another form of intimacy that doesn't involve talk whatsoever. So the example I give in the book is, in my 20s, I was on the stand-up comedy circuit in the UK, and I was in a double act with a friend called Jules, and we would not talk about our feelings. We think that's so naff, and like we just weren't comfortable with that, really, especially at that age. But we did all these gigs together, driving miles and miles to share bills together. We went through the adventure of trying to pursue a dream and going through all that, that range of emotions together, and seeing how we were reacting and seeing each other and sharing the space, sharing the journey, felt really intimate. And I don't think I've had a more intimate friendship than that, but it wasn't about talk. So there's like two ways of looking at intimacy, and they're both brilliant. But I think the thing that men struggle with is often we'll have the second form, or we have had that. And the first form, we don't have so much of an outlet for that. And we don't need loads of it, but we do need some for the reasons we've discussed already.
Just touching back then, reflecting on your own personal story, to get to the point where in search of your best man, when you were younger, maybe, moving into your 20s, university age, party age, were you did you have a lot of friends at that point?
Yeah, I mean, I did. Well, I certainly had enough friends that I didn't really think about it. But I think friendship looks different then. So this is what a big thing I thought about, and I realized is that I was comparing the friends I wanted now in my mid-30s to the friends I had when I was in my teen years or when I was in my early mid-20s. And they are a bit different. So much about friends in your 20s is doing new stuff together, and you're in these sharing flats. It's like the famous one, right? You were in a flat share in your 20s or at uni. You're going through college together. You're on sports teams, and they're brilliant. But because life is quite easy in your 20s for most people, you don't kind of need the more heftier friendships. But it's only when you're like, okay, time's a bit tricky. Do I have that outlet? Do I have that sort of friend? And I realized I didn't. And in a sense, I wasn't set up. I couldn't behave in a way that would allow me to have those friendships. I wasn't open to close friendships. So I wasn't like the guy you imagine in the school cafeteria sat alone eating his lunch by himself. But I didn't have I didn't have friends that I could rely on, and also they could rely on me.
Yeah, friendships, I'm thinking now in my own experience how different they look. My best friend now and the person that I run this podcast with, there's two of us.
Yeah.
We've been best friends since we were teenagers, but when I look back on it then, before we got into that university age, we were very much, our friendship was football. It was going to the gym and taking the piss out of each other. That was essentially the holy trinity of friendship back then. But there wasn't really a sort of a deep connection there. But fast forward years into our young adult life, I think the things that brought us closer together were maybe the first time he went through a breakup, or the first time that one of us had money issues in university, or when we were deeply stressed. And those were the moments I think that really forged our friendship. And so do you think that a lot of this intimacy issue that affects male friendships now stems from a maybe like a post-war mentality of strap your boots up, get on with it, other people have it harder, there's more important things, we need to carry on? Do you think we've almost brought that mentality with us into the modern day, which stops people having these conversations like I mentioned?
Yeah, I think there's something in that. So people listening to this might think post-war. I mean, the Second World War finished 70 years ago. Why are we still talking about it? But I suppose what we mean by that is some of these norms of masculinity. So ways we do being guys, it's kind of rules we bring to how we interact with one another. Is that getting in the way? And some of these are quite old fashioned, and we inherit them off our dads, and we get taught them in schools implicitly and from each other. And I think there is a lot to that. And I really realized this when actually I went to a party with my girlfriend, and we were just driving back from the party. And she said to me, like, because she knew I was looking to try and improve my friendships. And she said, do you know what you're like with other guys? Like, do you watch yourself? I said, what are you talking about? She said, like, you're completely different with blokes than you are with me or with women, you know. Like, you become this different person. You become like, you know, Dr. Take the Piss. And I would absolutely pride myself on being a world-class piss taker. Like, you know, that's, I think, like, and it's something really fun about that kind of vibe between men where we can absolutely banter each other to death. But I realized that I would become a lot more belligerent. Like I said, my body language changes. You know, it's kind of the one-upmanship in all sorts of different ways. Outside of conversations, men don't like to show their male friends that they like them, really. We don't like, for example, we don't like to be the ones that do the chasing, the organizing, because we think that's a bit needy. So we often sit in a holding pattern with our male friends, waiting for them to make the first move. Also, like, how I realized, like, when was the last time I told a male friend I so much as liked them? And I realized it would take me 6 or 7 pints to get to that point. And so these sort of norms, and then of course you've got the feelings thing, right? You don't want to talk about stuff because maybe you think it's a bit effeminate, or there's a big thing about, and I don't think men generally are homophobic. I should make that clear, but we do internalize that kind of sense of maybe being a bit, inverted commas, softer, or talking about the deeper stuff is maybe a bit gay, and it's not even conscious. Like, when I went to school, so I'm 34, we were called, like, we would use the phrase gaylord for like everything, like anything that wasn't like really normal. Inverted commas, like, you know, if someone came in with slightly long hair, like, you look like a gaylord, mate. Yeah. Or if they had weird shoes, bit gay, mate. Like, if they were good at French, bit gay, mate. Like, there was completely illogical. And but then also, like, very relaxed about genuine, you know, gay people. That was fine, but it was our way of policing each other to some of these norms. I think some of this is softening, but we do absorb it, and it gets deep into the soil of ourselves. It kind of gets in your marrow and your bones. You're not aware it's there or where it's come from. You just feel this real weird tightening in certain moments and a sense of awkwardness. Well, I can certainly say that it was true of me. And I think that's what we mean when we talk about the post-war mentality, these sort of rules that we internalize, and they get in the way of this intimacy.
Yeah, it's interesting because me and my best friend Joe, we have like we have a really close friendship now. To the point, I'll tell him I love him whenever I see him. Like, I got no qualms about that. But
awesome.
Growing, like, when we started becoming close, everyone always used to joke, like, or say, you know, you must be, have you seen your boyfriend today, sort of thing. And this and there seems to be this real, like, almost like you've seen the in-betweeners, like that in-betweeners approach to male friendship. And I don't know where this stems from. I don't know if it's like an insecurity thing or whatever, but there seems to be some sort of barrier to intimacy in all young men.
Yeah, there definitely is. And I also think there's something broadly in the culture where we don't really get male friendships, or we can only make sense of them in relation to other things. So, for example, you know, I'm sure, like, you guys together, it's great, clearly a brilliant friendship, but, you know, it might be called a bromance. Or some guy said to me when I was speaking about this the other day, he said, whenever I go out, say I'm to someone in the office, me and John, a friend in the office, are going out for a beer in the evening. They're like, "Oh, you're off on a man date?" It's like, it slightly undermines it, and it kind of paints it something that it's not. And it's like, just to be clear, there's nothing wrong with being gay, but it kind of, why do we have to label any sort of male closeness as something sexual? I should say that in what I found interesting in the research when I looked into it is that we think of friendships now, or relationships generally, and if you ask the average man or woman on the street who's best at them or who's naturally great at them, they'd say, well, women are the queens of friendship, queens of relationships. They just got more skills. But actually, for most of history, men have been considered the friendship kings. Women weren't considered capable of it. So if you look around sort of the ancient Greeks, and briefly mentioned Aristotle earlier, they thought that friendship was about sitting around, a bit like conversations like this, contemplating truths of the world, quite intellectual ideas. Women, they thought, were a bit thick, couldn't really cope with it. And then you've got, for the rest of history, a lot of what they called romantic friendships. So men being very open with one another, often sharing beds, hugging and talking about anything, writing each other lovely little letters. Now, most of those relationships weren't gay, but it was around the turn of the 19th century that when essentially homosexuality was invented. There's always been people having gay sex, but suddenly, around about the turn of the 19th century, being gay became an identity. So suddenly there were now gay people, and it was often linked to having a feminine upbringing by people like Freud. So suddenly men became very aware that certain behaviors were gay and therefore feminine, and stopped doing it because obviously hugely stigmatized. So I think what I'm trying to get across to people listening is a lot of this stuff we think about male friendship is a modern invention. Like, we don't have to believe it. It's not necessarily natural.
Yeah, so it's just really interesting that there's almost a sort of moment in time where there was just a switch, and yeah, that is really interesting. So what makes women in modern society so effective with their friendships? What is it that we could maybe look at them and try to emulate? What do they do so well?
Well, I mean, we kind of just draw off the thing we've just been talking about. They don't bring the same sense of rules that we've kind of discussed. So they're very happy to sort of confess that they like each other, be affectionate, verbally, physically, very happy to talk about everything, quite famously. There is an argument, and we can maybe get onto that later, that they talk too much about stuff and it's not always positive. And there's research, it's not just a cliche, there's also some research there. I think the main thing they do, though, away from those rules, is something I talk about in the book as emotional labor, which is quite a trendy term now, emotional labor. So emotional labor is understood as the work people do in relationships to keep people happy. So it's often quite a big feminist issue about the sort of work, like in families and relationships, that involve keeping people organized, making people feel looked after. So it's booking theatre tickets so people can go to the show. It's organising what you're doing on New Year's Eve. It's making sure there's milk in the fridge. It's being the one who buys the birthday card for the person whose party you're going to with your boyfriend. Whatever it is, those sorts of jobs generally fall onto women. And part of that is they take a similar mentality, women, I think, into how they maintain relationships. They do a lot of that work. My girlfriend said, I treat friendships as like on the lazy Susan of life, right? Like my career, like my health, like money, like friendships are one of the dishes on the lazy Susan. And I'm making sure that if I haven't, been in touch with a friend for a while, I'm calling them, I'm texting them, I'm making sure I'm getting in a date in a diary to have brunch or whatever it is. But she's very conscious about maintaining it and holding all of that in her head. And she said to me, the thing is with you, Max, is you don't do that. You don't put in the work, and therefore no wonder your friendships aren't great. And so I think that's the biggest thing we can do. I think I really believe that this was true of me, is I didn't have friendship on the dashboard of my life. And I didn't confess that I had a problem. And it took me to confess I wanted friends and I needed them, but also then to be more conscious about measuring it and doing the work and being the one who does that work. That is what made the biggest difference. And I think that is something that men can have role models for women pretty successfully.
You mentioned and I think you say in the book, is that men just simply, they don't put in the work. And a lot of people may not, look at the word work and think that doesn't go hand in hand with friendships. But what does the practice of work look like? Is it, taking time to have, to consciously have conversations with a specific aim in mind of trying to reach a certain connection? Is it trying to make more time for each other? What is work?
Great. It's a great question. I think this is really important stuff as well. So just to share a quick story, I spoke to a guy who's got great male friendships who I know. And I said to him, how do you do it? And he said, well, my mates call me the Sherpa, as in those soldiers in Nepal that carry everything up the mountain for the group of people. So they call me the Sherpa because I organize everything. But they said to me, Steve, if you didn't organize everything, we'd never see each other. And I thought, as a phrase, and there was one thing that I want to be remembered for as this phrase, which is not even mine, depressingly, is be the Sherpa. It's like a movement I want to start. So the be the Sherpa is this stuff of doing the work. So what does it mean to be a Sherpa? On one level, it is about being the one who shows leadership. And I think often this stuff with the relationships, men need it framed in sort of ways that they can relate to. And I think we want to be leaders as guys often. We can kind of connect to that, especially people who are quite type A, productive, they're trying to improve themselves, they're invested on living a great life. Show leadership. The flip side here is, like you say, it's like, well, what friendships, if they're good, shouldn't need this. A bit like, in a relationship with a romantic relationship, if it's right, it's right. When you know, it should just be simple. But I think anyone who's been in a long-term relationships, I've been married for almost a year. It's bloody hard, right? You can't just rely on it being easy all the time. Otherwise, you're going to eventually get pretty, pissed off and depressed about it. I think there's this idea of love, and I'm not saying friendship is love necessarily, but love is a verb. It's an action. It's an activity. You've got to be doing stuff. And there's maybe in the modern world, we think everything should be convenient as well. And we put our relationships in that. You can't order a friendship like you order an Uber or a Deliveroo. You've got to do stuff. And part of that is being the one who goes, firstly, the mental work of going, me and the boys haven't got together for a month. We better get a date in. I'm going to be on and gets a date in. I'm going to be the one who does that slightly tedious work on the WhatsApp group of going, when are you free? Sends the doodle poll, thinks of what you're going to do, books it, follows it up. And it can be a pain in the arse. But someone needs to do it, and you will be the one in the long run rewarded with great friendships. On an individual level, it's checking in with friends and going, how are you doing? Sending texts. It's organizing that meetup to have a beer. And it's also, I think, being the Sherpa is about doing the work of maybe role modeling some behaviors that are going to lead to great friendships with you guys. So for me, on a very simple level, I went for a drink with my friend Nick, who I loved hanging out with him, and he liked hanging out with me. We'd never talk about that, but it's like we can have a great night when we're together. But I started saying, mate, I just want to say I've been thinking about the most important friends in my life, and you are absolutely in the top 5, and I just wanted you to know that. And he was sort of like, like the alarm going off, being like, oh my God, someone get me out of here. Panic button. Disappeared for a trapdoor in the floor for a little bit, and then he was like, oh no, thank you, I like you too. So it's kind of like not Romeo and Juliet, but like doing that of going first with those sorts of things. But I should say, you can set things up so the work becomes less onerous. And we can maybe get onto that. That was another one of my big discoveries, is that friendships need structure.
Yeah, it's interesting talking about the work. This Monday just gone, my girlfriend had her friends round in the house, and the 3 of them were downstairs, and I was sat there as they were leaving, and they all whipped their phones out and they opened their calendar apps, and they were like, right, when are we all free next? And they'll book in without even a specific action in mind. They'll say, right, here's a date, we're all free next month on the 13th of September, and they like, before they even leave the house. And I thought, well, all the sort of male friendships I've known is very lackadaisical, very last minute. Is mate, we're down the pub, you come in, and there seems to be that that, like you mentioned, that lack of structure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a great example. So thanks for sharing that story. My wife is brilliant at that stuff. So I spoke to her on the phone last night, and she was driving back so we live in London. She was going to Colchester, which is about 2 hours drive from London, to watch a friend in a play. She's going to force herself to do that and to do the right thing. The week before, she did it with another friend in a play. She's an actor in Oxford, another 2.5-hour drive. Doing that stuff, I was just like, wow, you really put so much effort in. But like talking about structure, we can't rely on spontaneity and the miracle of syncing diaries, especially as we get a bit older. People don't like structure because we think spontaneity is exciting and romantic. And I am having this discussion with my wife at the moment because, you know, we've been together 5 years, only married for almost one, I should say. But, you know, you want to keep things interesting in a relationship. And my view is like, well, let's get a date night in and let's put Tuesday night in as a date night and let's book it in for a year. I'm like, let's get it in the Google Calendar. And she's like, why are you being a psychopath about it? But for me, I know, like, if we don't do that, it's going to be a lot harder to maintain it. And when we're in it, we'll love it. We'll love those evenings we spend together doing fun stuff. To talk to structure in a bit more detail, one of the leading researchers of friendship in the whole world is a guy called Dr. Robin Dunbar. He's a fascinating bloke. He's an evolutionary anthropologist. He's about 70 years old now. He's done all sorts of incredible work around evolution, but lots of research around relationships and friendships across across primates and humans. And we've talked about some of these rules, the post-war thing, the gender norms of how men do relationships. His theory and approach is different, and I am going to tie this back into structure in a sec. He says a lot of these differences are innate, and we've got to act with that in mind. So fundamentally, he said male and female friendships look different for good reason, and we've evolved to be like that. Female friendships tend to be face-to-face, based around talk, a lot of emotional disclosure, and tend to have really close one-on-one friendships. Male friendships tend to be side-by-side, often in groups, more casual. And the big thing about male friendships is doing stuff together. It is activities. And so he's looked at how friendships are maintained over time. For women, it's about talk. And this is on average. It's not true for everyone, for every relationship. But it's about talk on the phone, face-to-face. For men, it's about doing stuff together. It's about your five-a-side football. It's about walking up the mountain, camping, coming back down, the poker night, whatever it is for you, that is the crucial thing. What do we do when we get older? We get less time. Often we let these activities go. And again, the structure thing is, can you put something regularly in your diary to bring your friends together? So it's not about reinventing the wheel. The work suddenly gets a lot easier. I mean, I did a five-a-side thing fortnightly. I organise that now. I do a thing called Pub Club once a month. Literally rent out a small area in a pub, text everyone, say, bring whoever you like, come for 1 drink, 5 drinks, whatever. But it's regular. And that has made such a big difference. And Dunbar said the biggest thing you can do, the number one tip, is join a club. And again, it's about that structure thing. So, yeah, hopefully that's putting more flesh on the bones about what I mean by that structure, routine, ritual that kind of underlies a lot of brilliant friendship.
Yeah, I love that, and it's really practical advice, which is, you know, my favorite part of a podcast.
Yeah,
there's one thing that's been in my mind as we've been talking, and I wonder if you've ever had a similar experience or that you believe this to be true. But I've always found that within males that the friendships tend to be a lot, but severely less supportive. I've given this example a couple of times on the podcast, but when I was in university, I eventually ended up going into personal training as a career. But I remember when I was in university, I started an Instagram account, like a fitness Instagram account, right? And where I try and give advice, just try and, you know, get myself off the ground. And I remember not wanting to tell anyone. And I remember I was in my university housing. I lived with 5 boys, and I remember I set it up. I'd been posting for a couple of days. I woke up the next morning and I just saw the group chat was like just exploding. And I just saw my name and I was like, oh, fuck. So, you know, it's like boys ripping on each other. I opened it up and it was all just ripping me for starting this fitness Instagram. And it's like, Lewis thinks he's a fitness icon. and he was just constant ripping on me to the point where I just ended up private in the account and never touching her again. And then the following year, I was also in university, and I wanted to start this podcast. I didn't start this podcast until I was like 22, but I wanted to start it when I was 19, 20, and I started it just me talking about personal development books in my room in university. And I remember one day, again, my housemates found it, and like they would just rip shit into it, like for me for trying something. And I remember thinking, fuck. So I've always been quite tentative on, you know, being open about trying new things or having goals or dreams with sort of male friends. But with all the female friends I've ever had, I felt quite comfortable in telling them, you know, oh, by the way, I do this podcast, quite early on in the friendship. And I wonder why that is, whether it's like a bravado thing, an ego thing amongst men. Do you notice that tends to be a thing?
Again, this is a brilliant example, really rich. So thank you for bringing it in. So I talk about this a lot in the book. So let's address like the ripping thing, the banter thing, kind of ripping into you for that channel and that Instagram. On one hand, it's a sign. I think it's a lot of the way men communicate affection is through that way of doing it, and there is something to that. I'm taking the piss out of you because I know that I've kind of got the permission to do that, and I know enough about you that there's a sense of closeness there, and a game we're playing, and the assumptions under the game is I trust you to not necessarily think that I believe everything I'm saying, and we're having fun together, and there is something to that. But the trouble is actually, if you've only got one route of communicating, which was certainly true of me before this whole thing, I would have been that guy on the WhatsApp group, and it's true of a lot of men. If you've only got one route to communicating, what you end up doing is actually creating a culture within the friendship group or in the relationship where people feel they can't be open. And then what happens is they don't share. You're not sharing that part of you with that group of people anymore, right? Or maybe it's changed now, but then you said, right, I'm going to just close off. So this is what I mean by closeness, that you're not allowed to bring your full self to it. So what I'm not saying with all this stuff that men should become like women, I'm saying that let's bring every part of us to it. Let's have some conversations where we're ripping the piss out of each other and having a proper laugh. Brilliant. But also, let's have conversations where you can go, this is really important to me. I'm doing my best. I'm trying to do stuff, and I want you to engage with it, or at least listen, or not completely stigmatize it. And then to kind of, another thing I think comes up here is about, often you can be friends with people for too long and you change and they can't change with you. And at that point, you have to leave them behind. Because often what people don't like about their friends doing new stuff, like your Instagram, like your podcast, is you're becoming a person they don't know, and it terrifies them because they want you trapped in that time of life because they don't want to leave that time of life. They know that guy. They don't want you to become different. And this is maybe one of the things that is quite sad about friendships, is sometimes they live in a time of life and they can be brilliant then, and we need to move on and find new ones for new adventures, new parts of life. I've had friends before where they've got, because in my line of work, I've had friends some of them have become really famous, and like, we're not friends anymore because their life is different. And I don't resent that, but it's like we have to park it and go, good luck to you. We're going different ways. And I wonder if there's a similar thing here with this group of people, is that when you were kind of first, second year of uni, it's great. And then you're changing a bit. It's like, maybe you just need some different pals in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that again, through like reading personal development, I became aware of, that sometimes friendships, you do sort of outgrow each other or move in different directions. And I think it's quite common for a lot of people to want to hold on to friendships out of like nostalgia, or thinking we persona, like a cost sunk fallacy, I think they call it, where you sunk all this time into this friendship and you're thinking that 10 years can't go to waste. But so they'll hang on to these friendships even though they're bad for them.
Absolutely. So, and when I obviously spoke to tons of men about friendships in writing the book, and one of the biggest things that came out was not necessarily an out and out, I've got no friends or I hate my friends. It was more a more mundane thing, which is I'm in this friendship group, I'm friends with this guy, and it's just been drifting for ages, right? Because we maybe should have moved on, or our friendship used to be about university, or it used to be about the rugby team we were on that we're no longer on. And there's this guy called C.S. Lewis, who's obviously quite a famous writer, but he wrote a brilliant book called The Four Loves about different forms of relationship. And it's only short, and he's just such a good writer, but his kind of insight is that friendships need to be about something. A great friendship is about sharing a common journey. I think I put it in the book as a spot on the horizon. You don't look at each other, you look ahead, but you're moving alongside each other to get to that. He said the opening phrase of a close friendship should be, oh, you too, I thought it was only me. So that sense of sharing an idea or a sense of becoming something. And once you lose that, the friendship then loses its spice, its juice, its energy, however you want to express that. So I think a lot of the time it's about, and this is the thing I realized, like that friendship with Jules, who's a fantastic guy, but when we left the comedy circuit or moved in different directions, we lost that common journey, and it did drift, and it was just sad and difficult. Not just no one did anything wrong, but you do need to recreate new friendships. So this is the other thing, maybe to kind of tie it back to how we began the conversation, is it's not just about making sure the friendships you have are healthy and good, but also you've got to refresh sometimes, because life changes, and you kind of get different people on the convoy to go through those moments.
Oh, absolutely. There's a couple of things I want to touch on before we wrap up. The first one, I'm pretty sure you saw. I think I saw you mention it on online. But recently, we saw that big post-fight speech from Paddy Pimblett, Paddy the Baddy in UFC, where he talked about friendship and one of his friends committed suicide just out of the blue. And he said that encouraging men to talk to each other, that he'd rather have someone cry on his shoulder than him have to go to their funeral. It's quite sad that we need something tragic like that to happen as a reminder.
Yeah, it is really sad. And but Paddy Pimblett was great. So he's a UFC fighter, obviously, and he said it in the ring after his fight. And his post-match interview was really interesting. I think I saw it on PT Sport, and he said, in conversations he's had with friends in their group of friends, someone says something a bit vulnerable, and the other guy goes, "Why are you being like that, lad? Grow up." And it's that sense of how we police each other, right? And again, creating that environment where we are responsible for that and how we behave. So this thing doesn't happen by accident. But yeah, I think it's the thing about being reminded by terrible events. And I had two friends take their own lives during the writing of the book. So this stuff is not just hypothetical stats, it's real. And almost everyone I know has had a personal connection with this thing. And yeah, I don't know what it would take for us to take this seriously. I think the fact that people like Paddy Pimblett are sending a message is really important. So in the book is written in a funny way, and I'm a bit of an everyman. I'm not kind of someone who talks about gender nonstop, wears skinny jeans, mascara. If that's you, good luck to you. But I think a lot of guys hear these messages about masculinity and they switch off. They hear phrases like toxic masculinity and they go, "Oh, I don't want to listen to this. I'm just being lectured. I'm being told I'm horrible or bad." And a lot of men have had enough of this, and they don't trust the messenger. They think the message is packaged in a way that feels offensive or kind of a bit wet. That Paddy Pimblett, a literal fighter, a guy that I think a constituency of men can see a lot of themselves in, or a lot of what they'd like to be in, saying this message, I think is really powerful and important. And it's like, I think, and then your story kind of connects here. It's not as profound as the guy being told to grow up and then ended up later with someone taking their own life, but it is this sense of we can create these environments with just small changes in behavior. So I spoke to a psychologist called Fred Rabinovitz, and he said he runs men's groups and he's a men's therapist. He's from the University of Redlands in California. And he says, I'm not trying to make men into women. I'm just saying you've got to expand your toolbox, get more tools on your tool belt or in your toolbox, because different conversations require different tools. And all I'm saying, and all I think Paddy Pimlet is saying, is we just need a few more routes into conversation, and we need a few more tools in how we relate and connect to each other. And we need to be aware that when we do things like, say, grow up or man up, when someone says something vulnerable, that will have an effect. You are creating an environment where those conversations can't happen. And in the worst cases, it ends up in horrifying circumstances like Paddy Pimlet's friend.
Yes, I've always been interested by this idea of like redefining masculinity. I think a couple of years ago, I think I got on my bookshelf, I interviewed a guy called Dr. Ed Adams. He wrote a book called Redefining Masculinity. I can't see it, but I would recommend that book. And I've often wondered that what needs to happen, do you think? So just to end this conversation on a practical note, what needs to happen in terms of redefining masculinity to sort of reverse or start to entropy these problems that we see in male friendships? What needs to happen for that switch to flip?
The first thing is men need to see their relationships as part of a successful life and something they judge themselves on, they judge one another on. I would tell you before I went on this journey, to use a terrible phrase, that I'd be much more interested in being financially successful, fame successful, than having good relationships. They were just something that I wasn't even thinking about. And if I had relationships, they were almost a means to an end. They were just, and that sounds terrible, but I wasn't taking them seriously. But I think we need to redefine masculinity in a sense of our interdependence and not just our independence. So there's loads of research on this. That they do research, psychologists, around something called self-construals, but essentially they ask men and women to describe themselves, either just words they use or bring in photos and go, this is who I am. Women tend to define themselves in an interdependent way in relation to other people, husbands, kids, friends. Men tend to define themselves in terms of stuff, in terms of success metrics, in terms of their marathon time or what they can bench press. Like, we've got to change masculinity so that our relationships are part of how we judge each other and judge ourselves. So that's a big thing. I also think there's a massive thing with men and humor, where being funny is very central to modern masculinity, and there's a lot of joy in that, but it can't just be the thing that gets in the way. So making sure that banter is inclusive and not exclusive in terms of pushing people away. And then I think redefining finally is about not dropping some of these things that are sometimes really valuable in certain contexts. So being stoic, I know you've spoken to Ryan Holiday about the subject a lot and other people on your podcast. Being stoic and this idea of not always having to talk about emotions, or sometimes emotions not being appropriate. So a great example, in the war zone in Ukraine, no one's talking about toxic masculinity out there because men getting on with it and getting into a terrifying environment and not thinking about their feelings is appropriate in that context. But we've got to make sure that in other contexts, such as our conversations with our friends, that other behaviors are appropriate. We have other tools in terms of sharing vulnerable information about ourselves, talking about our hopes, our dreams, what we love, talking about the things we're struggling with. So those three different ways I think masculinity should be redefined, or can be.
Amazing. Love to sort of wind it down with our practicality, so I really appreciate that. I have two questions left that we ask every guest on the show. The first one, obviously you've written this book now, it's going to impact so many people, but what books have you read throughout your life that have had a massive impact on you and who you are?
Brilliant. I was thinking about this last night because I thought you might ask me this. So one is The Art of Loving by Erich Fromm. So Erich Fromm is a psychiatrist, and It's a really short book. It's super short. I think it's like 50, 60 pages. And The Art of Loving, he basically says in this book that we shouldn't see love as like a state you kind of enter into, you fall into or you fall out of. Love is an activity. It's a choice that you make every day. Love is a verb, right? And I think that's a really powerful way of looking at any relationship, especially romantic, but generally. And that, I think, is such a simple metaphor and a really short book, well written. That's had a big impact on me. There's a book called Into the Woods by John York, who is a screenwriter and a TV producer in the UK. It's about storytelling and structure. I reread that book every 3 or 4 months. It's just so useful in terms of structuring anything and in terms of how you communicate, scripts, articles, blogs, whatever. It's brilliant. And then finally, maybe one that's a bit weird, it's called Truth in Comedy by Del Close. So Del Close is a guru of improv, of comedic improvisation. And there's so much wisdom in that book. And one of the biggest, in my other life, I'm a director of an improv theatre and training centre called Hoopla in the UK. And I think if one thing you could do to improve your communication as a guy or anyone is an improv class. It's loads of fun. You don't have to want to perform. And I think improv just makes you a better person. So those would be the 3 I go for.
Amazing. And the final question I have for you, and this could be anything. It could be your work, it could be your family, it could be your friendships. But for Max Dickins right now, what makes a life worth living?
What makes a life worth living is obviously relationships, but even more than that. So I'm joining you now from the Edinburgh Fringe Festival in Scotland. I've got a show opening with a team of people. We're doing it with a director, 2 actors, producer. We're living together. We're going to walk up this mountain over the next month. We've worked really hard on it for months and months and months. And it's hard work to do, but it's exciting. And taking on a challenge that you're juiced at, that you don't know if it's going to work or not work, and doing that, but doing it with other people and those relationships you make on the way, I don't think there is a thing I love more in the whole of life than that. And it really gets me excited, but it doesn't always feel good. But when I get to the end or look back on it, I go, those are like the times you construct meaning and you get the most juice out of living. So that would be my answer to that question.
Fantastic. Well, Max, thank you so much for joining us today. Please let these guys listening and watching know where they can find yourself, find the book, and connect with you.
So the book is Billy No Mates, How I Realised Men Have a Friendship Problem. It's obviously available in shops and on the well-known online retailer, which is also a rainforest. And my website is maxdickins, dickins.com, and I'm on Twitter as well. Come and say hello. Always love to hear from people and hear feedback or your own experiences, as we've heard on the podcast today.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the value you brought today. I thought it was fantastic and a really important conversation. So thank you so much.
I loved it. Thanks for having me.